Hello there, and welcome. You found your way here at just the right moment when the day has wound itself down, when the lights are low, and when some quieter part of you is ready to set the world aside for a while. Tonight, we're going to travel together into one of the most intimate and quietly astonishing territories in all of human experience. We're going to spend some time with intuition. Now, that word might carry different meanings for different people. Some of us think of intuition as a kind of gut feeling, that sense of knowing something before we quite know why we know it. Others think of it as instinct or as something almost spiritual, a whisper from somewhere deeper than ordinary thought. Scientists have thought about it carefully and have, over the decades, begun to develop some genuinely remarkable explanations for what intuition actually is. And those explanations, as it turns out, are far more beautiful and far more reassuring than any mystery alone could be. Because intuition is not a trick. It is not a glitch. It is in many ways the most ancient and faithful companion your mind has ever had. It is the quiet hum beneath all your thinking and the vast library of everything you have ever experienced, softly catalogued and patiently waiting to offer you what you need before your slower, more deliberate mind has had a chance to catch up. Tonight, we will wander through that library together. We will visit the scientists who first began to understand it and the philosophers who wrestled with its meaning. We'll drift through research labs and ancient forests, through the lives of artists and surgeons and chess grandmasters and ordinary people standing in grocery stores. We will look at the biology of it, the neuroscience of it, the quiet poetry of it, and all along the way we will simply let this knowledge wash over us, not to memorize it, not to use it tomorrow, but to let it carry us gently somewhere restful. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. For now, let your shoulders soften just a little. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow to whatever pace feels natural. You don't have to do anything with any of the words that follow. You don't have to hold on to them. You can simply let them drift past you like clouds on a still evening, each one carrying a little something beautiful before moving on. Let's begin. Intuition begins in silence. That might seem like a paradox, because we tend to think of the mind as a loud place full of planning and replaying and worrying and wondering. But beneath all of that noise, something else is always working. Something patient and unhurried, sorting and connecting and building patterns out of everything you have ever seen or heard or touched or felt. Neuroscientists call this processing non-conscious, happening outside of awareness, outside of language, outside of the deliberate spotlight of attention, and it is, in almost every measurable way, enormously capable. The human brain contains somewhere in the neighborhood of 86 billion neurons. Each one of those neurons can form connections with thousands of others. The total number of possible configurations in a single human brain is so large that it exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe, a fact that scientists find genuinely humbling. And all of that astonishing complexity is not just sitting quietly while your conscious mind goes about its business. It is working, constantly, weaving meaning out of experience, building a kind of knowledge that doesn't always translate neatly into words. That is, in essence, what intuition is. It is the product of all that hidden work. It is your brain's way of offering you a conclusion without walking you through every step of the reasoning, because it has already done the reasoning quietly while you were busy with other things. It is in this sense a gift, a very old, very faithful and very wise gift. Let us begin by travelling back not too far, just far enough to understand how this idea first took root in the world of science. For most of recorded history, intuition was considered either a mystery or a miracle. The ancient Greeks had a word, nous, which described a kind of immediate perception of truth, a faculty that was somehow higher than ordinary reasoning, closer to the divine. Plato believed that certain forms of knowledge arrived whole and complete, without the need for argument or evidence. Aristotle was more cautious, but even he acknowledged that some forms of understanding seemed to arrive faster than rational analysis could account for. In the centuries that followed, philosophers continued to circle the question. René Descartes, who famously built his entire philosophy on the act of doubting, still allowed for something he called clear and distinct ideas, perceptions so immediate and vivid that they seemed to arrive without intermediary. Baruch Spinoza, writing in the 17th century, spoke of a third kind of knowledge beyond perception and reason, which he called intuitive knowledge. He described it as a direct grasping of things as they truly are. These were not small claims. These were some of the greatest minds in Western thought, all circling the same quiet mystery. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists began to approach intuition not as a philosophical concept, but as something that could actually be studied, measured, tested, examined under controlled conditions. And when they did, what they found was both surprising and deeply satisfying. Because what they found was that intuition is real. It is not imagination. It is not wishful thinking. It is a genuine cognitive process with its own neural substrates, its own timing, its own strengths and limitations. It is, in other words, a piece of the mind that the mind itself had not yet fully learned to see. And there is something quietly wonderful in that. That science, which we often think of as the opposite of mystery, turned out to be one of the great revealer of this particular mystery's depth. One of the first researchers to bring scientific rigor to the study of intuition was a Dutch psychologist named Ap Dijksterhuis. In the early 2000s, Dijksterhuis became interested in a question that sounds almost absurdly simple. When you have a complicated decision to make, is it better to think about it carefully or to sleep on it? Most people, when asked this question, would probably say, think carefully. We live in a culture that prizes deliberation, analysis, and rational argument. We are told to make lists of pros and cons. We are told to gather information and weigh it systematically. And for simple decisions, that approach works perfectly well. But Dijksterhuis suspected that for complex decisions, ones with many variables, many possible outcomes, many emotional dimensions, something else might serve us better. So he ran a series of experiments. In one version, participants were given detailed information about 4 hypothetical cars each with many different attributes, some good, some not so good. Some participants were then given a few minutes to think carefully about which car to choose. Others were distracted with puzzles for the same amount of time, so that they couldn't consciously deliberate. Then everyone chose a car, and the researchers assessed how good each choice was. The results were striking. The people who had been distracted, who had not been able to consciously deliberate, made better choices. Their non-conscious minds, working quietly in the background while they solved puzzles, had sorted through all the information more effectively than their deliberate reasoning had. Dijksterhuis called this unconscious thought theory, and while later researchers have debated exactly which conditions produce the strongest effect, the basic insight that our non-conscious minds are capable of remarkable feats of complex processing has been supported by a great deal of subsequent work. It is a little like the difference between stirring a bowl of batter anxiously and leaving it to rest. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a complex problem is to look away. There is something in the body, too, that participates in intuition. It is not only a mental process. The body has its own way of knowing, and scientists have spent decades trying to understand how that knowing works. One of the most famous demonstrations of this came from a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio. Damasio worked for many years with patients who had suffered damage to a region of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a small area tucked behind the forehead, connected to both emotion and decision-making. These patients, after their brain injuries, were fully intact in most cognitive ways. They could reason, remember, calculate. They scored normally on standard intelligence tests, but they had extraordinary difficulty making decisions in everyday life. Simple choices, what to eat for lunch, which appointment to schedule first, became paralyzing for them. To study this, Damasio and his colleagues developed what became known as the Iowa gambling task. Participants sat before 4 decks of cards. Each card, when turned over, produced a win or a loss. What participants didn't know was that 2 of the decks were rigged to produce big wins, but even bigger losses over time. They were bad decks. The other 2 were more moderate, more balanced, and over time would lead to profit. Most healthy participants eventually worked out which decks were better and shifted their choices accordingly. But here is what made the experiment extraordinary. Before they consciously understood the pattern, long before they could explain their reasoning, healthy participants began to show physical signs of anxiety when they reached toward a bad deck. Their skin conductance, a measure of subtle physiological arousal, would increase. Their bodies knew before their minds did. Their intuition was not just in their heads, it was in their hands. Patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex showed none of this. They had lost, along with their emotional processing, their ability to generate that quiet bodily signal, and without it they floundered. They couldn't learn from experience in the same embodied way. They would reach for the bad decks again and again, their intellect intact, but their intuition severed. This is what Damasio called the somatic marker hypothesis. The idea that emotions and bodily feelings are not distractions from good decision-making. They're essential components of it. The body marks certain choices with feeling, with a whisper of comfort or a flicker of unease, and those marks serve as rapid guidance, a first sorting of possibilities before conscious thought has had a chance to engage. We feel this all the time, though we may not have had a name for it. The slight tightening of the chest when something doesn't feel right. The inexplicable ease you feel in a room where something good is about to happen. Your body has been in more situations than you can consciously remember, and it has been keeping notes all along. If your eyes are growing heavy right now, that is perfectly fine. Let them close. You don't need to see anything to follow where we're going. Just let the words come to you softly, the way music does when you're not quite listening for it. The study of intuition has a particularly rich history in the world of chess. Chess players have long been observed to make decisions that they cannot fully explain, to glance at a board and immediately sense that something is wrong, or to feel the pull of a particular move before calculating its consequences. For decades, this was attributed to the genius of exceptional players, something ineffable and unreachable. Then, in the 1960s, a Dutch psychologist named Adriaan de Groot decided to study it more carefully. De Groot showed chess positions to players of varying skill levels, grandmasters, international masters, ordinary club players, and asked them to reconstruct the positions from memory after a brief glance. The grandmasters were dramatically better at this task, as expected. But de Groot noticed something more specific. Grandmasters didn't remember the pieces individually. They seemed to perceive the board in meaningful chunks, clusters of pieces that formed recognizable patterns, the way a skilled reader perceives whole words rather than individual letters. This idea was later developed by Herbert Simon and William Chase, who estimated that expert chess players carry in their long-term memory somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 such patterns, chunks of meaningful board configurations that they have encountered over years of play. When a grandmaster looks at a board and immediately senses a threat, they are not calculating, they are recognizing. Their brain is matching what it sees to one of those thousands of stored patterns and returning a rapid, reliable signal. I have seen something like this before. This is what it meant. That is intuition in its most elegantly studied form. It is not magic. It is memory, reorganized and made instantaneous. It is experience compressed into a feeling. Simon himself, who won the Nobel Prize in economics and made foundational contributions to cognitive science, estimated that it takes roughly 10 years of deep, deliberate practice in a domain to develop the kind of pattern recognition that reads as expert intuition. 10 years of paying attention, of making mistakes and learning from them, of accumulating precisely the kind of experience that the non-conscious mind can then transform into that quiet, rapid, trustworthy knowing. There is something deeply reassuring in this, because it means that intuition is not something some people have and others don't. It is something that grows quietly and steadily in anyone who has spent enough time paying attention to something they care about. There is a kind of intuition that shows up in creative work in the lives of artists, writers, composers, and scientists that has always fascinated the people who study it. It is the experience of sudden illumination, the moment when a solution or an idea or an image arrives fully formed, seemingly from nowhere. In French there is a word for it. L'esprit de l'escalier typically refers to a different phenomenon, but the experience that composers have described of a melody appearing whole in the mind has its own language in many cultures. In English we often call it inspiration, though that word carries echoes of something almost literally breathed in from outside. The mathematician Henri Poincaré left one of the most vivid first-person accounts of this experience ever written. Poincaré was working on a particularly knotty mathematical problem, the theory of fusion functions, if you're curious, and had been struggling with it for weeks. One evening he described setting the problem aside entirely. He took a geological excursion, stepped onto a bus, and at the moment his foot touched the step with no apparent mental effort, the answer came to him completely. He wrote later that he felt absolute certainty in that instant, even before he'd verified the solution, which he later confirmed was correct. This kind of story is common enough among creative and intellectual workers that the researcher Graham Wallace, writing in 1926, proposed a 4-stage model of creative thought that included a stage he called incubation. In Wallace's model, after a period of conscious preparation, gathering information, wrestling with a problem, there comes a period when the problem is set aside. During this incubation, though the problem is not consciously attended to, the mind continues working on it non-consciously, and then, often unexpectedly, illumination arrives. Scientists today understand this process somewhat more concretely, though not completely. When you stop consciously focusing on a problem, a different network of brain regions becomes active, what neuroscientists call the default mode network. This network, which includes regions in the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the hippocampus, is active during rest, during mind-wandering, during sleep, and it appears to be doing something genuinely creative during these quiet periods, making connections across distantly related memories, finding structural similarities between unrelated domains, weaving together threads that focused attention would never have thought to combine. The mind at rest is not empty. It is, in some ways, more capacious and more surprising than the mind at work. Which brings us gently to the question of sleep itself, and specifically to the role that sleep plays in intuition and insight. Because it turns out that the ancient advice to sleep on it is not merely a metaphor for patience. It describes something that actually happens at the level of neurons and memory and the delicate chemistry of the dreaming brain. During sleep, particularly during the stage known as rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep, the brain does something extraordinary. It replays the experiences of the day, but it does not replay them in order. Instead, it splices them together in unexpected ways, connecting memories that were laid down at different times, in different contexts, under different emotional conditions. It is as if the brain takes everything it has learned and shuffles the deck, looking for patterns that weren't visible when the cards were laid out in sequence. This process produces what sleep researchers sometimes call remote associative memory, the ability to connect things that seem unrelated, to see patterns across large spans of time and experience. And this kind of remote associative thinking is precisely the substrate of insight. It is what allows a solution to feel as though it came from nowhere, when in fact it came from a very patient, very thorough search conducted in the dark. A study by Ulrich Wagner and colleagues in 2004 demonstrated this beautifully. Participants were taught to solve a string of mathematical problems using a tedious step-by-step method. Unknown to them, there was a shortcut, a hidden rule that would allow them to solve the problems much more quickly. After a period of sleep, significantly more participants discovered the hidden rule than those who had spent the same time awake. Sleep, it appeared, had reorganized the information they'd learned and made the hidden structure visible. There is something almost tender in this. Every night while you sleep, your brain is quietly doing this work for you, sorting through the day's experiences, building bridges between ideas, quietly deepening your understanding of the world without any effort on your part. And in the morning, if you're lucky, you wake up knowing something you didn't quite know when you closed your eyes. Let us drift for a moment away from laboratories and towards something a little older, because intuition has been cultivated, practiced, and refined in human cultures for as long as there have been human cultures. Long before there were neuroscientists, there were healers who developed extraordinary diagnostic abilities through years of careful observation. There were navigators who could feel ocean currents through the hull of a wooden canoe. There were hunters who could read an animal's path from a broken twig or a disturbed patch of grass, knowing not just that the animal had passed, but how long ago and how fast it was moving. These were not supernatural abilities. They were the product of deep, sustained attention paid to a particular domain of the world over many years, until the knowledge became so thoroughly integrated that it no longer required conscious deliberation. It had become intuition. The master navigators of the Pacific Islands are perhaps the most extraordinary example of this. Polynesian and Micronesian peoples settled islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, using no instruments that we would recognize, no compass, no sextant, no GPS. They navigated by the stars, yes, but also by wave patterns, by swells generated by distant storms, by the behavior of birds, by the color and temperature of the water, by the smell of land on the air. Each of these cues was a kind of language, and skilled navigators spent years learning to read it. The navigator of a traditional voyaging canoe would sometimes lie on the deck of the vessel and feel the swells through the hull with his body, different swells from different directions, generated by different weather systems and deflected by different islands, producing a complex pattern of motion that he could interpret as a map. There are navigators still living today who carry this knowledge, and when they describe what they do, they describe something very close to what Damasio's patients had lost: a bodily knowing, a felt sense of where they are and where they are going, so thoroughly internalized that it feels less like thinking and more like remembering. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now. Let your shoulders drop a little if they have risen. Let the images of the ocean and the stars drift through your mind like something half remembered. You're exactly where you need to be. Intuition shows up in medicine in ways that researchers have only recently begun to document carefully, though clinicians have recognized it informally for a very long time. Experienced physicians often describe a phenomenon they call a sick feeling, an immediate, sometimes wordless sense, upon entering a patient's room or glancing at a chart, that something is seriously wrong. This feeling sometimes arrives before any specific symptom has been identified, before test results are available, before there is any obvious clinical reason to be alarmed. For many years, this phenomenon was treated with some skepticism in medical culture. Medicine prizes evidence, and a feeling is not evidence. But researchers who began studying it more carefully found that this intuitive alarm, when it occurred in experienced clinicians, was often clinically significant. It corresponded frequently to genuine medical emergencies that were not yet visible in the standard markers. A study by Dashay Keltner and colleagues explored how medical professionals integrate information differently depending on their level of experience. Novice practitioners tend to proceed systematically checking each possible diagnosis in sequence, gathering and weighing evidence deliberately. Expert practitioners often arrive at a hypothesis almost immediately before the systematic process is complete, and then use deliberate analysis to confirm or rule out that initial impression. Their brains are doing something the novices cannot, rapidly matching the current patient to the vast library of patients they have seen before, finding the closest match, and generating a first impression that is far more informed than it appears to be. This is why, in emergency medicine especially, experienced practitioners trust and act on that wordless sense of alarm, because it is not nothing. It is in fact the compressed experience of a career, offered in the form of a feeling. There is a nurse researcher named Patricia Benner who spent her career studying exactly this, the development of clinical expertise and the role of intuition within it. Benner described a progression from novice to expert in nursing, and at the expert level she found that the most experienced nurses often couldn't fully articulate their reasoning. They would say things like, "I just knew something was wrong," or "I couldn't explain it, but I asked for a second look." And when those instincts were followed up, they were often right, not always, but often enough to be taken seriously. Benner argued that this kind of knowing was not inferior to analytical reasoning. It was a different kind of intelligence, one that needed to be honored and trained and taken seriously, not dismissed as unscientific feeling. She was one of the first researchers to say plainly, "Intuition is a form of expertise. It deserves its own theory, its own language, its own place in our understanding of how skilled people know things." We might pause here to consider what it actually feels like to have an intuitive experience, because the phenomenology The inner texture of intuition is quite varied, and researchers have tried to describe it carefully. Sometimes intuition announces itself as a bodily sensation, a tightening or a relaxation, a pulling toward or a pulling away. Sometimes it arrives as an image, a sudden mental picture that seems meaningful before you know why. Sometimes it is more like a certainty than a sensation, a sense of knowing that something is true or right, accompanied by a peculiar calm. And sometimes it arrives as the opposite of calm and unease, an alarm, a sense that something is off, even in the absence of any visible evidence. The cognitive psychologist Kenneth Bowers described intuition as a preliminary feeling of coherence, a sense that things are fitting together in a meaningful way before you can articulate how. He asked participants to examine pairs of words and judge whether the pairs were related, whether they shared a common associative theme. Sometimes they were related, all words connected to cold, say, or all connected to night. Sometimes they weren't. What he found was that participants could tell significantly better than chance whether pairs were related even when they couldn't identify the connecting theme. Their sense of coherence was reliable even when their explicit knowledge was absent. That is a remarkable finding. It means that you can know something is true, in some meaningful functional sense, before you know what you know or how you know it. The feeling of coherence is itself a form of information. Think of it the way you might think of a song you almost recognize. You haven't quite placed it yet, but you know with some certainty that you know it. The recognition is present before the retrieval is complete. That gap between the feeling of knowing and the content of knowing is a little window into the architecture of intuition. Intuition and emotion are deeply intertwined, and this has sometimes caused trouble for people who want to trust one and not the other. We live in a culture that often treats emotion and reason as opposites, as if feelings are what distort our thinking and logic is what corrects it. But the neuroscience of the last 30 years has made this picture increasingly difficult to sustain. Antonio Damasio's work, which we visited earlier, is part of a larger body of evidence suggesting that emotion is not the enemy of good reasoning, it is a prerequisite of it. Without the ability to generate bodily felt markers, to experience the emotional weight of consequences, decision-making becomes rudderless. The patients Damasio studied were not made more rational by losing their emotional processing. They were made, in a very practical sense, less functional. Other researchers have extended this picture. The neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux spent decades studying the amygdala, an almond-shaped structure deep in the brain that is central to the processing of emotional information, particularly fear and threat. Ledoux discovered that the amygdala receives sensory information through what he called a low road, a fast, direct pathway that bypasses the cortex and allows for extremely rapid responses to potential threats. Before your thinking brain has had time to analyze a situation, your amygdala has already evaluated it for danger and begun preparing your body to respond. This is intuition of a very particular kind, the kind that keeps you alive, the flinch before the car passes too close, the surge of alertness when something in a room feels wrong, the body moving before the mind has caught up. These are not irrational responses. They are very old, very fast, very reliable systems that evolution has spent hundreds of millions of years refining. They deserve respect, even when they occasionally produce false alarms. There is a concept in psychology called thin slicing, the ability to extract accurate information from very small samples of behavior. The psychologist Nalini Ambady pioneered research in this area, asking whether brief, silent clips of behavior could yield reliable information about personality, teaching effectiveness, relationship quality, and other complex human variables. In one famous study, Ambady asked participants to watch 30-second silent clips of teachers in the classroom so short, so muted, that no content could possibly be assessed, only manner, movement, and expression. She then asked participants to rate those teachers on various dimensions of effectiveness and warmth. When she compared those ratings to the evaluations those teachers received from students who had actually spent a full semester in their classes, the correlations were striking. People watching 30 silent seconds knew, in meaningful ways, what a semester of students had concluded. In another study, Ambady shortened the clips to just 6 seconds. The correlations held. In yet another variation, she reduced them to 2 seconds. Even that was enough for participants to extract reliable information. These are not infallible judgments. They're impressions, and impressions can be wrong, especially when they are influenced by bias rather than genuine signal. Ambady and others have been careful to note that thin slicing can amplify prejudice as easily as it can reveal truth. We tend to read familiar patterns as positive and unfamiliar ones as suspicious, regardless of their actual meaning. Understanding intuition means understanding both its power and its pitfalls. But the fundamental observation stands. The human mind is extraordinarily sensitive to patterns in behavior, patterns that reveal something true and important, even when they are glimpsed in the briefest possible window. We are, at our core, pattern recognition machines of the most sophisticated kind. You're in no hurry, neither is this world we're exploring together. If sleep is beginning to find you, let it come. The words will carry on around you, gentle and unhurried, and if you drift away and come back, it will be just as if you never left. There is a kind of intuition that appears in relationships, a sensitivity to other people's inner states that goes by various names. Sometimes it's called empathy, sometimes emotional intelligence, sometimes social intuition. But whatever we call it, the phenomenon itself is consistent and measurable, and when we look at the science beneath it, genuinely beautiful. The human face is capable of producing something like 10,000 distinct expressions. Researchers who have spent careers studying facial expression, most notably Paul Ekman, who began his work in the 1960s, have found that a subset of these expressions are universal across cultures, present in the faces of people from vastly different societies, from New York to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Fear, surprise, happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, contempt. These basic emotional signatures appear in recognizable form across the human family, suggesting that they are not learned behaviors but something deeper, something older, something written into us by our long-shared history. Most people read these expressions rapidly and without effort. We glance at a face and we know in an instant that something is being suppressed, or that the smile is genuine rather than polite, or that there is sadness beneath the cheerful surface. We do this without deliberation, and usually without even being able to explain afterward exactly what cued us. Something in the quality of the eyes, perhaps, or a micro-expression that lasted less than a quarter of a second, a flash of real feeling that slipped through before the social mask could come back down. Ekman discovered these micro-expressions and devoted a great deal of his career to studying them. They're involuntary. They last between 1/25th and 1/15th of a second, too brief for ordinary conscious perception, but long enough for the non-conscious mind to catch and process. People who are trained to notice them, as some law enforcement professionals and therapists are, can detect them deliberately. But most of us detect them non-consciously. They inform our impression of a person without ever surfacing as explicit thought. This is social intuition at its most basic level. It is the equipment we are given from birth for navigating the complex emotional terrain of other people. And in the people who have developed it most fully, skilled therapists, gifted diplomats, the people we describe as having extraordinary social grace, it operates like a kind of second sight, a continuous fluid reading of the emotional weather around them. There is a quieter version of this same sensitivity that shows up not in facial expressions, but in voice. The human voice carries an enormous amount of information beyond the words. It speaks information about mood, health, confidence, deception, social status, and emotional state. We pick up this information intuitively, often without realizing we are doing it. Researchers have found that listeners can reliably detect a speaker's emotional state from their tone of voice alone, even when the words are stripped of meaning, replaced with nonsense syllables, or played backward. They can identify anxiety, sadness, warmth, authority, and several other emotional states from voice quality, rhythm, and pitch alone. We are, it seems, tuned to receive this information at a very deep level. This extends in some unexpected directions. Studies have found that people can often detect whether a stranger likes them or not from just a brief audio sample again, without access to the content of the speech. They can detect, from voice alone, whether a person is speaking to someone they love or merely someone they are fond of. They can sometimes detect whether a person is lying, though this particular ability is more variable and more contested in the research literature. Human lie detection, it turns out, is not nearly as reliable as most of us believe it to be. Still, the sensitivity of the ear to emotional information in voice is remarkable, and it operates for the most part without effort. You do not decide to notice the weariness in someone's voice, or the excitement, or the careful flatness that suggests they are holding something in. You simply hear it, and something in you responds, not always with conscious thought, but with understanding. From voice, we might move gently to touch, because intuition is not only a visual and auditory phenomenon. The body as a whole participates in social knowing, and perhaps nowhere is this more vivid than in the remarkable communicative range of human touch. A series of studies conducted by Dasha Keltner and Matthew Hertenstein found that people can communicate a surprisingly wide range of specific emotions through touch alone. In these experiments, one person touched another person's forearm through a curtain so that neither person could see the other. The toucher was instructed to communicate a specific emotion: gratitude, compassion, happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, love, or others. The person being touched then guessed what emotion was being conveyed. For emotions like gratitude, compassion, and love, participants identified the correct emotion at rates far above chance, sometimes as high as 70 or 80% accuracy. They could distinguish a sympathetic touch from an affectionate one, a comforting touch from a congratulatory one. The quality of pressure, duration, movement, and temperature all contributed to a rich communicative signal that the receiving person could read with remarkable accuracy. We tend not to think of touch as a form of intuitive knowing, but it is. When someone places a hand on your shoulder and you feel immediately whether it is a gesture of support or a gesture of control, you're doing something cognitively sophisticated. You're reading a complex signal rapidly, without deliberation. Your body knows. The philosopher Michael Polanyi had a phrase that captures something essential about all of this. He wrote, "We can know more than we can tell." This became one of the most cited observations in the literature on tacit knowledge that is held in practice, in the body, in the doing of things, rather than in explicit verbal form. Polanyi used the example of riding a bicycle. You know how to ride a bicycle. You cannot explain in precise and complete terms exactly what you do with your body to keep the bicycle upright, to lean into a turn, to recover from a wobble. The knowledge is real and reliable, but it resists being fully told. Expertise in almost any domain produces this kind of tacit knowledge. A skilled carpenter knows how much pressure to apply to a joint before the wood tells him it's right. An experienced teacher knows when a class has genuinely understood something and when they are only performing understanding. A virtuoso musician knows something about the relationship between breath and phrase that no notation can fully capture. These are not superstitions. They are real forms of knowledge, deep, embodied, reliable, that live below the level of language. And they are, in every case, built from the same raw material, years of careful, attentive experience, gradually internalized until the knowing becomes as natural as breathing. Allow your breathing to find its own slow rhythm as we continue. There is nothing that needs your attention right now. The night is quiet and we are simply wandering together through these gentle ideas, letting them settle wherever they will. There is a remarkable study that gets at the way intuitive knowledge can be more detailed and accurate than conscious knowledge, even in relatively ordinary tasks. Researchers asked experienced radiologists to identify tumours in medical images, a task that expert radiologists do with impressive accuracy, relying heavily on learned pattern recognition. Then they did something unusual. They used a technique called continuous flash suppression to show the images subliminally below the threshold of conscious perception. Even when they couldn't consciously perceive the images, experienced radiologists showed evidence in their eye movements and physiological responses of having processed clinically relevant information from the scans. Their non-conscious systems were extracting signal that their conscious perception hadn't caught. This is not a universal finding. It doesn't mean that non-conscious processing always outperforms conscious attention, and subsequent researchers explored the precise conditions under which each operates best. But it does suggest that the gap between what we consciously perceive and what our brains actually process is considerably larger than most of us assume. The brain is, in this sense, always doing more than we know it is doing. It is always watching, always sorting, always building the quiet library from which intuition eventually draws. We might spend a little time now with the idea of beginner's mind, a concept that comes originally from Zen Buddhism, though it has found its way into modern psychology and creativity research in interesting ways. The phrase refers to a quality of openness, of approaching even familiar things without the assumption that you already know them fully. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki wrote, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few." This might seem to contradict everything we've been exploring: the value of accumulated experience, the power of expert pattern recognition. And there is a real tension here, one that researchers take seriously, because it is true that expertise, for all its power, can also produce blind spots. Expert pattern recognition is fast and usually right, but it is built on the patterns of the past. When a situation is genuinely novel, when the rules have changed, or when a familiar pattern conceals something unprecedented, the expert's intuition can fail in spectacular ways. This is sometimes called expert blindness, or in a more specific form, functional fixedness. The tendency to see things only in terms of their established categories and functions, missing possibilities that a less experienced observer might see freshly. Experienced engineers sometimes miss elegant solutions that occur immediately to students approaching a problem for the first time. Experienced physicians sometimes take longer than medical students to recognize unusual presentations of common diseases because their pattern library doesn't include the atypical case. The wisest practitioners seem to hold both things at once, the depth of experience and the openness of attention. They use their expertise as a first response and then stay curious, continuing to look, continuing to ask whether there is something this situation is telling them that doesn't fit the pattern. This is in essence what distinguishes the truly extraordinary practitioner from the merely very good one. Not more knowledge, but more willingness to be surprised. There is a lovely concept in architecture and urban design called wayfinding. The set of skills and intuitions that allow people to navigate an unfamiliar environment. Some people are naturally gifted wayfinders. They seem to know, almost without thinking, which direction to turn, how to get back to where they started, how to build an accurate mental map of a space from just a few walks through it. Research on spatial intuition has revealed some interesting things about how this works. People who are good at navigating unfamiliar environments tend to pay attention to specific kinds of landmarks, particularly landmarks at decision points, corners and junctions, where the path could go multiple ways. They encode not just the landmark itself, but its relationship to their own body. It was on my right when I was heading north. I remember which allows them to reconstruct the route from multiple directions. This isn't a conscious strategy for most skilled navigators. It's simply what they find themselves noticing without effort, because their spatial sense has learned over time what's worth remembering. Taxi drivers in London, before GPS, had to pass an extraordinary test called the Knowledge, a grueling certification process that required memorizing the layout of 25,000 streets and the locations of thousands of points of interest within a 6-mile radius of central London. Researchers who studied the brains of London cab drivers found that they had measurably enlarged hippocampi, the brain region central to spatial memory compared to matched controls. The hippocampus had grown to accommodate the demands placed on it. The brain, as it turns out, is not fixed. It changes with use. It grows toward what it needs to do. This is true of intuition as well. The quiet knowing that accumulates in any domain is not simply a byproduct of experience. It is the result of a brain that has been physically reshaped by that experience. New connections formed, old ones strengthened, neural pathways worn smooth by repetition, until what once required effort becomes, in the most literal neurological sense, second nature. In the world of sport, intuition operates at extraordinary speed. Elite athletes in fast-moving sports, tennis, soccer, ice hockey, basketball make decisions in fractions of a second that would require many seconds of deliberate analysis if undertaken consciously. A tennis player returning a serve that arrives in under 300 milliseconds cannot possibly watch the ball all the way to the racket. They must begin moving before they know where the ball will go, reading cues from the server's body, the angle of the shoulder, the toss of the ball, the subtle rotation of the wrist cues so rapid that they are processed entirely outside of awareness. Researchers who have studied these anticipatory skills have found that expert players see differently from novices. They do not track the same things. They attend to the most predictive cues, the ones that carry the most information about what will happen next, and they attend to them earlier in the sequence. A novice watches the ball. An expert watches the shoulder, or the hip, or the moment of contact with the ground, because those earlier cues are more informative. The expert's gaze has been trained over years to find the signal before it becomes obvious. Wayne Gretzky, who is widely considered the greatest hockey player who ever lived, was famous for an ability that he himself described in almost mystical terms. He always seemed to know where the puck was going to be rather than where it was. Researchers who have analysed his play have suggested a few complementary explanations. He had an exceptional read of the game's patterns, he positioned himself to take advantage of the most probable developments, and he had developed through extraordinary practice an ability to anticipate the trajectories of play before they unfolded. But whatever the mechanism, the experience of it from the inside was precisely what we might call intuition, knowing without quite being able to say how. There is a lovely frontier in intuition research involving what scientists call implicit learning that happens without conscious awareness. In a classic paradigm developed by Arthur Reber in the 1960s, participants were shown strings of letters that followed complex grammatical rules so complicated that they would be difficult to articulate even with time and effort. Participants were simply told to memorize the strings. They weren't told there were rules. Later, they were shown new strings and asked to judge whether each new string followed the same rules. What Reber found was that participants could do this. They could distinguish grammatical from ungrammatical strings at better than chance rates, even though they couldn't explain what rules they were applying. When asked what they were doing, they tended to say things like, "I don't know, it just feels right," or "something about it seems off." Their non-conscious minds had extracted the rules from the examples without being asked to, without deliberate effort, and without producing any explicit reportable knowledge. This is implicit learning, the acquisition of knowledge through exposure without intention or awareness. And it is not a rare or exotic phenomenon. It is in fact happening constantly in every domain of experience. You've been implicitly learning the grammar of your social world, your workplace, your neighborhood, your family throughout your entire life. You know things about how those systems work, what gestures signal status, what rhythms indicate comfort or tension, what small departures from normal mean that something has changed that you couldn't fully articulate, but that guide your behavior accurately and reliably. This is one of the most quietly astonishing things about the human mind. It is always learning, even when it doesn't know it is. If your mind is beginning to soften around the edges, to let thoughts drift rather than hold them, that is exactly right. There is nothing here that needs your full attention. These ideas are for the part of you that receives things easily or without effort. Let them come and go as they will. We've been spending time with the science of intuition, but we might also spend a little time with its history and art, because artists have always had a complicated and deeply interesting relationship with the question of where their ideas come from. For the ancient Greeks, the answer was relatively clear, or at least relatively mythologized. Ideas came from outside. The Muses were the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne memory, and they were believed to literally breathe inspiration into the artists who are worthy of receiving it. The word inspiration itself comes from the Latin inspirare, meaning to breathe into. There was, in this ancient conception, nothing internal about creative intuition. It was a gift from elsewhere, arriving in the prepared and open vessel of the artist. This idea persisted for a very long time. Renaissance artists spoke of divine inspiration. The Romantic poets wrote of being seized by forces larger than themselves. Mozart famously, if perhaps not entirely accurately, was said to compose music that arrived whole and complete, requiring only transcription, not creation. The composer Brahms spoke of a state during composition that he called exaltation, a condition in which ideas seem to flow from outside him, through him, onto the page. What modern psychology tends to say about this is something more material but no less wonderful. The artist, in this exalted state, is drawing on an enormous reservoir of absorbed experience, every piece of music they have ever heard, every conversation they have ever had, every image that has ever moved them, and their non-conscious mind is reorganizing and combining that material in ways that feel from the inside, like receiving rather than generating, because the process is hidden, because it happens outside of awareness, because when the idea arrives, it arrives complete, without visible seams. The mathematician John von Neumann once said something to this effect about his own experience of mathematical insight, that the ideas didn't feel as if he'd generated them through deliberate effort. They felt as if he'd found them, already there, and merely needed to pay attention at the right moment. The finding and the creating were, from the inside, indistinguishable. There is a concept in Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on creativity that is worth dwelling on here: the experience of flow. Csikszentmihalyi spent decades interviewing artists, scientists, athletes, surgeons, chess players, and others who performed at extraordinary levels of skill, asking them to describe their experience of doing what they did best. What he found, across an enormous diversity of domains and cultures, was a remarkably consistent description of a particular state of consciousness. In flow, people report that effort seems to disappear. The work simply moves through them rather than requiring them to push. They lose track of time. Self-consciousness dissolves. The distinction between the person and the activity softens, and what remains is pure absorbed doing. Csikszentmihalyi found that this state tended to occur at the intersection of high skill and high challenge, when a person is working at exactly the edge of their ability, where the task is difficult enough to require full engagement, but not so difficult as to produce anxiety. In this narrow corridor, something shifts. The conscious, self-monitoring, evaluating part of the mind falls quiet, and what remains is something that operates with greater fluidity, greater responsiveness, and interestingly greater intuitive access to accumulated skill. This is something musicians describe when they say that their best performances feel more like listening than playing, something athletes describe when they say the game slows down and the right move appears before they've had to think about it, something writers describe when they say that the best sentences arrive already written, and all they have to do is be there to receive them. Flow, it turns out, is not a mystical state. It is a neurological one associated with patterns of brain activity in which the prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-monitoring and deliberate evaluation, becomes relatively quiet, allowing the more automatic pattern-based systems to operate without interference. It is, in essence, what happens when we get out of our own way. Let us visit for a few moments the science of dreams, because dreams are, in some ways, intuition's most theatrical expression, the mind's non-conscious processing made visible however briefly and however strangely in the form of imagery and narrative and feeling. The neuroscience of dreaming has advanced considerably since the discovery of REM sleep in the 1950s by Nathaniel Kleitman and his graduate student Eugene Aserinsky. What we now understand about dreams is both more concrete and more mysterious than either the purely symbolic interpretations of Freudian psychology or the purely random neural static hypothesis that flourished for a while in the 1970s. Dreams, current evidence suggests, serve multiple functions. They appear to play a role in emotional processing, helping us integrate and metabolize emotionally significant experiences, often by replaying them in contexts that are altered or displaced enough to reduce their intensity. There is evidence that people who sleep and dream after learning emotionally negative material show better emotional regulation in relation to that material the following day, suggesting that REM sleep is doing something therapeutic to the emotional charge of experience. Dreams also appear to contribute to creative insight in ways we already touched on. The default mode network's activity during REM sleep produces what some researchers have called hyper-associative thinking, a loosening of the normal constraints on thought, allowing distant connections to form. The logic of dreams is not the logic of waking life. In dreams, things can be two things at once. A place can be familiar and unknown simultaneously. A person can shift identity without ceremony, and in this surreal, unconstrained space, the mind sometimes finds connections that waking logic would refuse, and sometimes those connections prove, upon waking, to be real and valuable. The chemist August Kekuli famously claimed that the circular structure of the benzene molecule, one of the most important discoveries in organic chemistry, came to him in a dream, in the form of a snake seizing its own tail. The story may be somewhat embellished in its retelling, as such stories often are, but the underlying experience it describes an intuitive leap, arriving in the language of imagery and symbol, bypassing the slow route of deliberate analysis, has been reported too many times by too many credible people to be dismissed entirely. We might move now towards something that sits on the very edge of current scientific understanding, and I offer it not as established fact, but as an active area of inquiry, because the uncertainty itself is interesting. Some researchers have explored whether human intuition might involve sensitivity to information that is not mediated by the known senses, what parapsychology calls extrasensory perception, or psi. The mainstream scientific community is, on the whole, deeply skeptical of such claims, and the reasons for that skepticism are serious and well-founded. The history of parapsychology is littered with poorly controlled studies, demand characteristics, methodological errors, and at least some cases of outright fraud. But there is a more interesting conversation to be had about the genuine edge cases, the experiences that most people report at least occasionally and that resist easy conventional explanation. The sense of being watched, the feeling that something has happened to someone you love before any communication arrives, the strange and repeated experience of thinking of someone just before they call. These are so common as to constitute something like a universal human phenomenon, and their explanation, if there is one, is genuinely not settled. Mainstream cognitive science offers several partial explanations. Our pattern recognition systems are so sensitive and so good at finding signal in noise that they inevitably produce false positives. We notice the times when the sense of being watched proved correct and forget the many times it did not. We tend to think of people we're close to in regular rhythmic ways, which increases the probability that we'll be thinking of someone at the moment they reach out to us. And our minds are very good at finding retrospective meaning in coincidence. These explanations are compelling and probably account for the large majority of these experiences, but the margin of uncertainty is wider than the confident dismissal sometimes suggests, and whatever the ultimate explanation turns out to be, the experiences themselves are data. They tell us something about the sensitivity of the human mind to patterns and signals that we do not yet fully understand. let us return to firmer ground and visit what might be one of the most beautiful applications of intuition in science: the role of aesthetic judgment in scientific discovery. Many scientists describe a feeling of rightness or elegance that guides their work at crucial junctures, a sense that a particular hypothesis or approach is beautiful, even before they can prove that it is correct. The physicist Paul Dirac famously said, "It is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment." This is a startling claim from a scientist, but what Dirac meant, I think, was something specific, that mathematical beauty of a particular kind tends to correlate, in the history of physics, with truth. Equations that are elegant, that balance symmetry with surprise, that have a kind of internal rightness, have tended to endure. Equations that are ugly, that require many arbitrary parameters or inelegant special cases, have tended over time to be replaced. Dirac's own contribution, the Dirac equation, which predicted the existence of antimatter before antimatter had been observed, is one of the most beautiful equations in all of physics. Dirac arrived at it through what he described as a process of aesthetic searching. He was looking for an equation that would satisfy certain mathematical symmetry requirements, and what emerged predicted a particle, the positron or anti-electron, that he initially found baffling, and that was confirmed by experiment a few years later. This is intuition operating at the highest level of abstract thought, a felt sense of rightness guiding the search through a vast space of mathematical possibilities long before the usual tools of verification can be applied. And it works, not always, but often enough that physicists and mathematicians take it seriously as a guide. The mathematician G. H. Hardy wrote something in this vein that has stayed with many readers. Beauty is the first test. There is no permanent place in mathematics for ugly mathematics. This might sound like mere aesthetics, but it reflects something real about the structure of mathematical truth, that deep, fundamental results tend to have a quality of inevitability and elegance, while results that are merely correct but not fundamental tend to feel, in the hands of mathematicians, cramped and contingent. There is a field of study called naturalistic decision-making that was born, in part out of frustration with laboratory-based decision research. Gary Klein, one of its founders, began his work by interviewing experienced decision-makers in high-stakes, time-pressured environments: firefighters, intensive care nurses, military commanders, and asking them, in detail, how they made their decisions. What he found was that they almost never did what classic decision theory predicted. They did not generate multiple options and compare them systematically. They did not calculate expected utilities. In most cases, they identified a single course of action, assessed whether it would work, and either implemented it or adjusted it. And they did this with extraordinary speed and reliability. Klein called this the recognition-primed decision model. Experienced decision-makers, he argued, don't choose between options. They recognize situations as belonging to familiar categories and generate the option associated with that category. The recognition is the decision, and it happens largely through a process that Klein describes as mental simulation, a rapid, almost imaginative rehearsal of how the chosen option will play out, checking it against intuitive knowledge rather than formal analysis. What is striking about Klein's research is not just what it describes about expertise, but where it occurs. These are not laboratory studies of people solving puzzles with unlimited time. These are studies of firefighters making decisions inside burning buildings, of nurses recognizing early signs of sepsis in newborns, of military commanders responding to ambiguous intelligence under fire. The intuition being studied here is the kind that operates under the highest possible stakes, and it performs in the hands of the experience with remarkable effectiveness. Klein is careful to note that this is not the whole story. In genuinely novel situations that fall outside the recognized categories, intuition can fail in serious ways. And in environments where feedback is slow, unclear, or absent, the pattern recognition on which intuition depends cannot develop reliably. A doctor who receives clear, timely feedback on their diagnoses develops good clinical intuition over time. A doctor who rarely learns whether their diagnoses were correct may develop confident feeling intuitions that are not actually reliable. The quality of intuition depends heavily on the quality of the learning environment that shaped it. This is an important qualification. Intuition is not infallible. It is not a substitute for careful thought in high-stakes novel situations. It is a tool, an extraordinary and undervalued tool, but a tool with its proper domains of application and its genuine limitations. There is something worth saying here about the intuition of children. Young children, before they have developed the elaborate conceptual frameworks that structure adult cognition, sometimes show a kind of openness to pattern that adults have lost or suppressed. Developmental psychologists have documented what they call intuitive theories in very young children, implicit understandings of physics, psychology, and biology that guide their expectations and reasoning long before any formal instruction. Infants only a few months old show surprise when objects seem to pass through solid surfaces, or when they disappear without moving behind an occluder. This surprise, measurable in how long they look at an unexpected event compared to an expected one, reveals an implicit understanding of physical objects, that they are solid, that they persist when hidden, that they follow predictable paths. No one taught this. It appears to be built in or to develop spontaneously from the earliest experience of a physical world. Young children also develop what psychologists call theory of mind, an understanding that other people have inner states, beliefs, and desires that may differ from their own, and they develop it on a remarkably consistent developmental schedule across all the cultures where it has been studied. This intuitive social understanding is not taught in any formal sense. It develops as if it were waiting to unfold, shaped by social experience but driven by something internal. These early intuitions are not always correct. Young children are famously prone to certain systematic errors, confusing appearance with reality, for example, or over-attributing intention to inanimate objects. But they reveal something important, that the human mind comes equipped with starter kit intuitions about the world, frameworks that have been so reliably useful across evolutionary time that they have been, in some sense, built in. We arrive in the world already knowing something in the most implicit and quiet of ways. Let's wander now through something a little different, the experience of intuition in music, which is perhaps where it lives most naturally and most visibly. You've been here long enough tonight. You can go now. Sleep well and good night.